Image selection can be done either through the HTML5 input tag or through the Image Picker plugin. We'll also cover an option on how to store the image data and reload it for later use. By simply using an input with type equals file, you can support image selection. The example above restricts the types of files using the except attribute. So this only allows files of a particular MIME type to be loaded. In this case, any MIME type that starts with image would be accepted. We could also change this to be more specific to just doing a GIF, JPEG, PNG. But in this case, this will select any MIME type that is an image. The file input template reference variable allows the element to be referenced to access the selected files. The change event handler will execute when an image is selected, passing in the selected files. And the multiple allows multiple images to be accessed. On the iPhone, an action sheet appears allowing the user to select from the photo library or the file system. On Android, you may be asked permissions to view files. Multiple files can be selected if the option is included in your input tag. The input UI is very basic. Ionic doesn't provide any CSS for file input. It is suggested that you override it with your own CSS. The images returned by the input will be a file object, which is also a blob. A blob is a chunk of raw bytes used for binary data like images. The file input will pass in an array of file objects when it calls the change event handler. The example checks that a file is selected and displays the name of the first file. When an image is displayed in HTML, it expects a URL which is either pointing to the local file system or a remote server. So our standard image source equals, this would be looking for a file in the same directory as the HTML page from which it was rendered. The file input won't allow us to get access to the file path of the selected file, so we can't use that as a URL. The only way to display an image in HTML without uploading it to a server is to use a data URL. A data URL is a URL with the data of the file embedded directly within the URL. The browser does not have to load the content of the file from a different location. The syntax is as displayed here. The data component of the data URL must be in a text format because HTML is text. The media type defines the MIME type of the data. Therefore, binary data like images must be first converted to base 64, which is a text encoding. The base 64 encoding is a technique to convert 8-bit binary data into a text string so that it can be sent, for example, in emails or web pages or URLs, etc. It's called base 64 because each number in the encoding has only 64 values, unlike 8-bit numbers which have 256 values. The 64 values are then translated to safe characters. Note that the only punctuation is the plus and the divide or slash. No other special characters are used. Note that a JavaScript file object is also a blob, so the following technique may work for any blob. This is the summary of the technique. Create a file reader, create an onload event, which will trigger once the file has been loaded. In the event handler, we will have access to the blob data as a data URL, then read the blob data in as a data URL using the file reader. The code here is an example of this process. Here we have enhanced the previous function to allow for reading of multiple files. The selected files are looped over and the base 64 data is added to an array of image data. We can use a data URL directly as the source attribute of the image. One way we can do this is to use a template variable. Seeing the example here where we have an image, source, and we have our binding syntax on a variable called image file. We need to create the image file as a property of the class, and it's just going to be a string. In the example on the previous slide, we assigned the data URL to the image file property, which will then instantly be displayed. When we want to display multiple images, we need to loop over the array of images to generate our list of images. Here we can use an ng for loop to loop over an array of image files. Then each image from those image files can be displayed as part of the looping process. Since the image data has been converted to a data URL, which is simply a text string, we can store the data URL in Ionic storage. This is no different to storing a normal string. So we can store the data URL when the image is selected. Finally, we can check for an image value in storage and use that value to display an image. We can also store files to the local system when we run the app on an actual device. For this, you will have to use an Ionic native plugin to manage the file system. If you wanted the image to come from a camera, you will also have to use another Ionic native plugin to manage the camera. So at the beginning, I mentioned we can use either the HTML input tag of type file, or we can use the plugin called Image Picker. So to use the Image Picker plugin, we first need to add the Cordova plugin using the Ionic Cordova plugin. And we're going to add this Cordova plugin Image Picker. We then also need to install it using npm to add the Ionic native plugin wrapper for it. And we use the npm install and our link here for Image Picker to install the Ionic side of that particular picker. Once you have imported the Image Picker and injected it into your constructor, you can then call the getPictures method, passing in any required options. If the output type is set to 0, a file URI will be returned. If the output type is set to 1, a base 64 encoded string will be returned. Once triggered via an event, the getPicture method will display a screen for the user to select images, which can then be shown in the app in the same way as we did with the HTML5 file input method.